Okay, so how do you tell a visionary from a con artist?
That's a good question.
Like in a world where you've got all this charisma and controversy kind of all mixed together,
Yeah.
where do you draw the line between like genius and grifter?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of times we're drawn to these figures who seem larger than life,
Right.
and we kind of want to believe in their brilliance, you know, the innovation and people who can like bend the rules and somehow come out on top.
Yeah. It's very seductive, isn't it?
Yeah.
And today we're going to try to answer that question through the story of Brian Molony.
Okay.
So this is the man whose gambling addiction led him to embezzle millions of dollars from the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce.
Wow.
And we've got a whole stack of articles and excerpts from books and even a movie review to help us unpack his story.
Sounds like a lot to dig into.
Yeah, and I think it'll be a good one.
I'm ready.
So his story really exemplifies this whole question of, was he a visionary who just took risks too far? Or was he just a con artist driven by his own demons?
A good question.
So let's start with the man himself, Brian Molony.
Okay.
So on the surface, he seemed like a pretty ordinary bank employee.
Right.
He lived modestly, drove a beat-up car, wore kind of cheap suits.
Interesting.
But hiding beneath that unassuming exterior was a secret.
Okay, what was it?
A crippling gambling addiction that ultimately led him to embezzle over $10 million.
Wow, 10 million.
$10 million.
Yeah,
Huh?
that's wild. So it's like the classic double life almost.
Yeah.
This contrast between outward frugality and then these millions of dollars he's wagering.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of hints at some kind of deeper psychological conflict?
I think it has to, right? I mean,
Yeah.
maybe it was a form of self-sabotage or like a desperate attempt to maintain some kind of control.
Yeah, well, it's like he was trying to balance the scales in a way.
Exactly. And, the sources that we looked at, they paint a picture of a man who was driven by forces that were really beyond logic.
Yeah, I mean, he was described as a workaholic. And he barely even seemed to notice the lavish perks that the casinos were showering him with.
Oh, interesting. So it almost sounds like it wasn't even about the money for him.
Right.
It was something else.
Exactly. And that really makes you think, how do we reconcile that kind of intelligence with such reckless behavior?
Right.
Was it just a case of addiction really kind of overriding any rational thought?
Yeah, that makes you think. I mean, addiction can be so powerful.
Absolutely.
And I think to get even deeper into that, we should talk about this film called Owning Mahoney,
Yeah.
which is actually based on Maloney's story.
It got rave reviews, didn't it?
It did, yeah. It was praised for its accurate portrayal of compulsive gambling, and it even received a 4.5 out of 5 rating for accuracy from the Center for Gambling Research.
That's pretty high praise.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's pretty reliable as
What-
far as trying to understand what was going on with him.
Right, and there's this one scene that I think is really powerful, where a psychiatrist asks Maloney, on a scale of 1 to 100, how would you rank the thrill that you get from high-risk gambling? And Maloney answers 100.
Wow, 100.
Yeah.
Out of 100.
Right.
That's incredible.
And then they ask him about the most exciting experience he's ever had outside of gambling.
Oh, wow. Okay, what did he say to that?
20.
20.
Yeah.
That's a huge gap.
It really is. I
Mm.
think that really just highlights how addiction can warp your perception of pleasure.
Right.
It makes even the most amazing things in life seem dull in comparison to the thrill of the gamble.
Right, like it just completely hijacks your reward system.
Exactly.
So it's almost like for Molony, the thrill of the gamble, the risk, the possibility of winning it was like the sole source of meaning in his life.
It seems like it. Yeah. I mean, it's tragic in a way.
It really is. So how did he actually fuel this addiction?
Through a very elaborate embezzlement scheme.
Okay.
He created fake loans. He cooked the bank's books. He even smuggled cash to avoid airport security. It was pretty wild.
That's pretty brazen. I mean, there's this one anecdote where he had to stuff $350,000 in cash on his body just to get through security.
I mean, can you imagine?
It's crazy. It's not exactly the image of a successful banker that comes to mind.
No, not at all. I think it just shows you the lengths that addiction can drive someone to.
Yeah, it really does.
It wasn't about greed in the traditional sense. He needed to gamble regardless of the cost.
He was driven,
Yeah.
but it wasn't just Molony who was involved in this whole dangerous game.
Right.
I mean, the sources, especially the film, they point to the role of Caesar's Atlantic City in enabling his addiction.
Okay, how so?
Well, they flew him in on private jets. They
Yeah.
gave him VIP treatment,
Mm-hmm.
all to keep him at the tables gambling.
Right, because the house always wins.
Yeah,
They knew that Maloney was a problem gambler, and they were taking advantage of that.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, what is the ethical responsibility of institutions like casinos when it comes to individuals who are clearly battling addiction?
That's a tough one.
Are they just providing a service, or are they actively contributing to someone's downfall?
I don't know. There's definitely a gray area there.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just the casino.
Right.
Because Molony's own bank, the CIBC, they had these serious security flaws that allowed his embezzlement to go undetected for so long.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, were they just blinded by this image of a successful young banker? Did they miss the warning signs?
Right. Or was there like a deeper systemic issue at play?
Yeah, like a failure of oversight or accountability.
Potentially.
It's a cautionary tale, I think, for any institution.
Yeah.
It highlights the need for safeguards and ethical considerations. Blind trust can be exploited pretty easily.
Definitely.
Yeah,
And in this case, it led to some pretty dire consequences.
for sure.
So stay tuned as we delve deeper into this rabbit hole.
I'm ready. It's kind of like everyone was focused on this image of success that they totally missed the cracks underneath.
So it all came crashing down eventually,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Molony gets caught. What happens?
So he was arrested in April of 1982,
Okay.
the day after he lost $1 million at Caesars.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine the fallout from that?
I can't even imagine, like,
$1 million.
$1 million in one day.
At Caesars, yeah.
And then he's arrested.
The next day.
Wow.
Talk about a bad week.
Seriously. So what were the consequences? For him,
Lord.
for the casino, for the bank?
Molony pleaded guilty to embezzlement,
Okay.
and he ended up serving 6 years in prison.
6 years.
Yeah, and as for Caesars,
Yeah.
they faced a pretty hefty fine,
Okay.
and they had to close down for a whole day.
Really?
Yeah, it was more of a symbolic gesture
Right.
for their role in enabling Molony's addiction.
So basically, a slap on the wrist for Caesars and 6 years for Molony.
Pretty much.
And I'm guessing a whole lot of finger pointing behind closed doors.
Oh, I'm sure.
But it's interesting, though.
Yeah.
Molony's story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it doesn't.
What happened after prison?
So after he was released,
Oh,
he married his girlfriend, Belinda,
wow.
who had actually stood by him through the whole ordeal.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and he seemed really determined to turn his life around,
Good for him.
make amends for his past.
Like a political hope in this otherwise kind of dark story.
I think so.
Did he ever go back to finance?
He did,
Really?
but not as a banker.
Okay.
He became a business consultant,
Interesting.
and he was advising companies on risk management and fraud prevention.
Wow. Talk about turning a negative into a positive.
Right.
From embezzler to expert,
Exactly.
helping others avoid the very pitfalls that he fell into.
I think that's amazing.
It really is. It makes you wonder if maybe that was part of his motivation all along. Like to understand and control the forces that led him to those extremes.
Yeah, maybe he was trying to find meaning in what happened.
Right.
I think his story really highlights the human capacity for change and redemption. Even after such a huge fall, he was able to rebuild his life.
And contribute to society.
Exactly.
In a positive way.
Yeah, it's inspiring in a way.
It is. So after this deep dive into Brian Molony's life,
Yeah.
the question remains, grifter or gifted?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it?
It is, was he a mastermind con artist?
Yeah.
Or a brilliant mind tragically undone by addiction?
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, he was clearly intelligent and capable,
Right.
but his gambling just took over.
Yeah, like he was living two separate lives.
Right.
The successful banker and the reckless gambler.
Or they were feeding each other.
Yeah, in this really dangerous and destructive cycle.
I think that's a good way to put it.
I mean, the allure of risk,
Yeah.
the thrill of the gamble, it can really take hold of anyone.
Even the most disciplined people can be vulnerable to it.
And his story raises a lot of questions
It does.
that are relevant to all of us.
Like what?
Like, how do we recognize the warning signs in someone who might be taking things too far?
Yeah.
Where do we draw the line between ambition and recklessness?
Good questions.
And maybe most importantly, what's our own relationship with risk and reward?
Those are all things we should think about.
It's like a cautionary tale,
Yeah.
but disguised as this thrilling true crime story. We're all drawn in by the intrigue,
The high stakes.
the larger-than-life characters. But I think we come away from it with a deeper understanding of human nature.
I agree.
both its brilliance and its fragility.
Definitely. And the sources we looked at, they really emphasize that.
Yeah.
Not just Molony's actions,
Uh-huh.
but the role that institutions played in all this.
Like Caesar's.
Yeah, and even his own bank.
They enabled him.
It makes you think who's really benefiting from these systems.
And who's left holding the bag when things fall apart?
Important questions to consider,
Especially in today's world.
where it's hard to tell the difference between innovation and exploitation.
For sure. It all comes back to that original question. How can we tell the difference between a visionary and a con artist?
Right. Is there a surefire way to know who's legit and who's just out to make a quick buck?
Yeah, like, is there some kind of test we can use?
I wish there was,
Me too.
but unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Okay.
It takes a lot of critical thinking,
Hmm.
a good dose of skepticism, and a willingness to dig deeper.
So no shortcuts.
Not really.
We can't just rely on charisma or a compelling story.
Nope.
We have to do our homework.
Exactly. It's about asking the tough questions.
Okay, like what kind of questions?
Well, for starters, what are their motivations?
Hmm.
Where's the proof to back up their claims?
Okay.
Who benefits from their actions?
Right, right.
And maybe most importantly, what are the potential consequences?
Both good and bad.
Exactly.
So it sounds like we need to be more like detectives.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Carefully examining the evidence, weighing the different perspectives, and ultimately reaching our own conclusions.
I think that's a great way to approach it.
And in a world where we're bombarded with information,
Right.
it's more crucial than ever to sharpen those critical thinking skills.
Absolutely. We need to be discerning consumers of information.
Yeah,
Question our assumptions and avoid falling for easy answers.
because complex problems rarely have simple solutions.
Exactly.
So after this deep dive into the world of Brian Molony, what's the main takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the biggest lesson here is that risk and reward are two sides of the same coin.
That's a good way to put it.
Ambition and a willingness to take risks can lead to incredible things, but they can also have devastating consequences.
For everyone involved.
Exactly.
And it's a good reminder to never take things at face value.
Right, just because someone is charming or tells a good story doesn't mean they're trustworthy.
We have to look beyond the surface, examine their motives, and be wary of anyone who promises the moon.
Especially if it sounds too good to be true.
Wise words.
I try.
So here's one last thought for our listeners.
Okay, I'm listening.
Could a Brian Molony scenario happen in today's world?
With all the digital banking and advanced security measures,
Exactly. Or has the nature of risk itself evolved?
have we learned from the past, or are we doomed to repeat history?
Let us know what you think.
We'd love to hear your take on this.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complicated world of grifters and the gifted.
It's been a fascinating discussion.